Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the quality of meat, and this is one of my sort of personal bugbears and favorites. Bugbear because, I see a lot of people trying to cut corners, and I'm a member on a number of forums where people, beginners and experienced curers all come together and talk about their experiences. And I very often see how people boast about the cheapest cut of meat that they could find at the local supermarket. Now, I don't want to tell you what to do. I mean, it all comes down to specific budgets and what one can afford and what one can't afford. And so I need to pin what I'm going to say and say, look, get into this art form because it's fantastic. But always purchase the best meat that you can possibly afford. Don't ever go for the cheap cuts and think, well, geez, I've got such a good deal. And then obviously if it's a good deal, it's a good deal, but understand what the meat is. And, if you're going to buy a cheap cut of meat, there's a few things you need to consider here. Number one, if it's on special, the reason why it's on special is it's either very close to its sell-by date, and most supermarkets are obliged to get rid of produce by a specific date. And this means that they're obviously close to that sell-by date. And so they're putting it on special so that they can get rid of it. Now, one of the things I mention in the book is that meat that you use for charcuterie should be as fresh as you can get it. It shouldn't be hung. It shouldn't have been stored for long periods of time. And the explanation is in the book as to why. So if you're now going to buy a cheap cut of meat that is on special, again, it's an older piece of meat, so you've just got a little bit more chance that this is going to go sideways. So again, and then it becomes expensive because then you've spent the money and you've wasted it. So and I always go back to an age-old saying in South Africa in Afrikaans, and I'm going to give you the direct translation, but it basically says something that you buy cheaply is worth what you paid for it, and it's apt. So again, I pin it and I say, I'm not a snob. I also work on a specific budget, but I always purchase the best I can afford. The proviso I would make with buying cheaper foods or cheaper meats is if you're going to make fresh sausage, then I would say, that's cool. That's a great deal that you can get, or that's a good deal that you got. Make fresh sausage with it, because what's going to happen is you're going to add flavorants to it. So it's going to mask any residual flavors that the meat may have if it's really from the animals have not had desirable feed. And you're going to cook it. So any bacteria that there might be is going to get killed through the cooking process. But if you're going to dry cure, get the best quality meat that you can get, that you can find, and that you can afford. And that's all I can say about that. So don't go for the cheap cuts. You go to your local supermarket and see deals. That meat is generally quite old. The other reason for that is it might be that the supermarket has purchased a whole lot of meat from a different country because they got it on the cheap. We don't know. We don't know where that meat comes from. We don't know what it's about. So I think what I go back to saying is you've got to understand, if you do want to do this seriously, is to get to know where the meat comes from. And that's part of the fun of this, is to go and source the meat. Find a butcher. I know it's difficult in some countries these days because of the run of supermarkets. The US, particularly in South Africa, where I lived, it was even similar to that, because you had these massive supermarkets and oftentimes you didn't really have a butcher. You know what? Just go out of the city a little bit, go find a smaller town around the city. Generally, the smaller towns will have a butcher available, and you can build up a relationship with that butcher. Go to the butcher and say to them, hey man, this is what I'm doing. And they'll be intrigued and want to see what you're doing. Now, I built up my relationship with my butcher at the time, when I was still living in South Africa, that I actually used to go and break down the pigs in the butchery. He would allow me to come and do that before I set up my commercial kitchen. and that was great. And we always used to talk about the different cuts, and he was getting more involved in it as well, and that's fantastic. And so you'll spark interest with this. And butchers generally tend to cut meat differently to what we want, in charcuterie. So you can educate the guy that way as well. And again, I emphasize this. I mean, I know, for example, in the US, I've seen a lot of questions around what cut is the copper. The copper is from the neck. And in America, you've got what you call the Boston butt. And the neck comes out of that, but it actually extends. The European cut is a long cut. It extends through the Boston butt. So what you cut off the Boston butt is actually not the entire copper. And so you're only going to have a much smaller piece. So if you've got a butcher who's willing to work with you, you can get the exact cut of meat that you want. The way you break up the hind leg to make a prosciutto is different to how the butcher breaks it up for domestic cuts. So these are the things that just, again, makes your experience a little bit better. But that is if you can do that. I mean, I understand if you're living in a city, it's sometimes difficult to get to a butcher, but something like butchering is coming back in a big way. And, you really can, in most decent, in most big cities, you will now find decent butchers again, people who specialize. I know they're sometimes going to be a little bit more expensive than they're going to be a little bit more expensive than the supermarkets, but I promise you, it's really worth your while. And the last thing I'm going to say is, I did cover this in the book as well, is if you can build up a relationship with a farmer directly, that's even better. I mean, that literally is kind of utopia when it comes to obtaining meat. But there are, you've got to go through the health and safety guidelines in your country. You might not be able to purchase directly from farmers because they would have to, process the meat through an abattoir. But again, talk to find a farmer and explain to him what you're doing. And the other thing that you need to consider is that a charcuterie cut or charcuterie pig is usually quite a lot larger than a pig used for domestic consumption. Typically, and I'm going to talk in kilograms here because that's what I know, but typically a pig that will be slaughtered for commercial consumption is usually done at about 60 kilograms, whereas for charcuterie, we're looking for pigs about 100 to 120 kilograms. And there's a very specific reason for that. When I built up my relationship with a farmer where I was getting my pigs from, I got to understand how pigs, grow. And the reason for why, in commercial world, it's done the way it's done. And what actually happens is farmers don't want to take the pigs further than sort of 80 kilograms because they grow very quickly to between 60 and 80 kilograms. And then there's a slow sort of phase up to a larger pig size, like 100, 120 kilograms. And that's where the cost comes in for the farmer. So he has to now spend a whole lot more on fatting up that pig to get it to the point where he wants it. And again, you've got to consider whether it's a free range or an organic pig. They've got to feed, so you've got to provide them food somehow. So so it's about managing their time. So it's much easier for them to have the pig slaughtered at sort of 60 or 80 kilos, and it's much cheaper for them to do that. And the other aspect is that obviously in a domestic environment, you don't want the big cuts because you're cooking in a smaller oven. You've got a fridge that you've got to, you hold the meat in. So I mean, the difference in a hind leg or a ham from a charcuterie pig, you're literally going from something like 8 kilos for the whole with on the hoof for a domestic sized pig to a charcuterie pig where you can go anywhere up to 14, 15 kilos. So it's almost double, even more than double the weight of what, the size of a domestic pig or size of a pig that would be slaughtered for domestic usage. And the same goes for all the other cuts. And you can imagine how big the bellies are. I mean, they get really thick compared to what you would buy commercially. So, just consider those things. And if you do build up your relationship with your farmer, you can say, well, you can pay him, or you can agree to let him have a couple of pigs that he takes up to 100, 120 kilos for you. And that's fabulous. But again, you got to pay heed, because then he might want you to take the whole pig, and how are you going to slaughter that in your kitchen? So those are all things you just got to consider when you do this. And again, just circling back to what I said in the beginning, I'm not saying that you should not purchase meat that you can afford and that it's no go. I mean, get into this art form, get what you can afford, but manage it properly. That's what I'm saying. Meat that's on special, chances are it's a bit older and you may pick up problems. I'm not saying you're going to get problems. I'm just saying you may get problems with bacteria or spoilage down the line. So just work it. If you're going to buy cheaper cuts, use it for sausage. There's always a time and a place for everything. And the whole idea around the quality of meat is really to produce the best quality item at the end. I also sort of prophesize the use of organic meat as opposed to commercial meat. I just from a humane point of view, I think it's better that animals have a life where they roam as freely as possible. I mean, I'm not going to get into a philosophical debate about what's good or bad, but that's just my personal opinion. And obviously what they eat. And you got to understand a pig, and I say this often, a pig is the one animal that tastes the most like what it eats. So if it's going to be fed nonsense, it's going to taste like nonsense, and particularly in dry cured meats. Sausage, even dry cured sausage, not so much. But if you've hung a ham for 18 months and you slice into it and it really hasn't got a nice taste, it's probably down to the fact that that's what it's been eating. Now, I know in most countries they do now try and regulate what animals eat, and that does help. In South Africa, they were still letting people feed or put fish meal into the meat, into the feed that the animals get. I know in many countries around the world now, they actually are banning the use of other meat products in what you feed in what you feed animals that are going to be used for commercial consumption. So that's a good thing. But again, the best is, and you've got to go back to the Italians and the Spanish. The best hams in the world, Balata ham, what do they eat? They eat acorns. Not for the entire life. They finished off on acorns, but that gives them that really special nutty flavor, the pata negras. And the Parma ham, the Parma ham gets its unique flavor from the way that comes from the Parmesan or the Parmigiano factories, and that gets fed to the pigs, and that's a prerequisite for having for producers who make Parma ham, is that they have to source pigs that have been fed this particular way. So and that gives it its unique flavor. So again, that just shows you that what you feed the pigs is what it tastes like. So the best, I built up my relationship with my butcher. When I built up my relationship with the farmer, I worked with him as to what I wanted the pigs to eat. And I mean, I sparked an energy in him, and he saw an opportunity here, because this is a growing industry now. This whole charcuterie movement is growing, and he saw a unique opportunity. And interestingly enough, we were fortunate enough at one point to be put on TV, and he as my provider was also on the show, and he started getting calls from butchers who wanted organic meat. And I know, I mean, there's a debate around what is organic and what is not organic. I know that it's very difficult to get pure organic meat, and we can go into those debates, but we won't. But get as close to the best free range organic meat that you can get, and the only way to do that is to build up a relationship with a farmer or with a butcher who specializes in organic meat and sourcing organic meat. And then you can say to him, look, source me this meat. I'm looking for charcuterie cuts. Work your magic. Find me cuts that are from pigs that are 100, 120 kilos. Alternatively, buy the whole pig from the butcher and say to him, look, I can't take the whole pig. I want you to break it down for me, and you can freeze it. Because again, just getting back to safety, one of the things that I always advocate is that you freeze the meat before you use it. And I know a lot of people say it's not necessary because there's no measles or there's no trichiosis or anything like that. It's not really required if you're buying something that's come through commercial abattoir because it has been checked. But you know what? I just don't take the chance. When I buy the fresh meat, I come home and I freeze it for a minimum of 6 to 8 days, and at minus 17 degrees centigrade. So that's the sort of norm. And then I use it. So you can do the same thing with your butcher and say to him, look, I want certain cuts. When I do, so just to give you an idea, when I do something like whole legs, then I try to do them as fresh as possible. But if I'm doing coppers or lanzas or anything like that, I don't really mind freezing them for a while. But again, if you are buying directly from a farm and you have the ability to do that, you should always just freeze your meat. Period. No questions asked. I do tend to like working through an abattoir, and that's what I did with the farmer that I worked with. I mean, I would buy whole pigs from him, and they would get slaughtered at an abattoir. And the nice thing about working through an abattoir is that they have veterinarians that do check the animals for the various diseases, and obviously, if they have those, then they won't get slaughtered. So you pretty much say it's pretty much a safe bet that you're going to get, safe meat or healthy meat. But again, I always just freeze the meat anyway. I think that's basically what I want to say about the quality of meat. And I can't emphasize it more. The quality of the meat really is the result of the end product that you're going to get. And that's also, you'll see in a lot of my recipes, I don't use a lot of aromatics in my recipes. I don't over spice. I see some of these guys, they've got recipes where it's coated in pepper, and which is fantastic. If that's your taste, I go for it. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Personally, I'm a guy, and again, if you read the book, it goes back to when I was 5, when I started my first experiences with meat. I was always taught that the meat should be the center, or your main actor, or the center of attention in the whole show. And for me, that's it. I never overspice stuff. I never add too many spices because I want to taste the meat. The only reason why we would add spices to the meat or overspice it is if we're trying to mask something else. So again, I'm very, and that's why most of my recipes I've worked on, I've actually downscale, and as I said in the book as well, when it comes to recipe and making your own recipes, I don't think there's a new recipe out there. I think it's, most of the chefs that produce recipe books, nothing is unique anymore. It's all been done and dusted. Techniques might change, but the general recipes are recipes that are now, handed down and stolen here and checked there and read here, and it's how we tweak those for our own personal tastes. I don't think there's a unique recipe out there. If there is, then that's fantastic, and share it with us because we'll publish it. But I seriously don't think that there is a unique recipe that somebody hasn't tried. So, for me, I take the recipes, and I often find that they're either too salty or there's too much spice on them. And I look at that and I first experiment with it as it is, make the recipe, and then I know, wait, hang on, there's too much chili on that for me. I like chili, but I can't taste the meat. So what's the point? So I might as well just eat a chili then. So you then just break down exactly what it is that you want to do, and then you start experimenting. And then you find the balance or your palate that you like. And so my recipes you'll find are fairly, I wouldn't say bland, but they're not as spiced as many other people would like. But the beauty of that is you can always add spice. You can never take it away, but you can always add more. So that's the cool thing about that. And again, showcasing the quality of the meat. That's what you want to do. When I come to smoking as well, you'll find that I've seen recipes where people smoke things for day on end. I don't like that, because smoking is just another aromatic that you're adding. In days gone by, it used to be done like that for days because it created that sort of smoky crust on it, which would protect the meat from insects and bacteria and all that sort of stuff. But we don't really need that today. We've got refrigeration. So, and this is the thing, we have to also take from tradition what's good and leave what's bad and make up our own new traditions. And for me, like smoking, the quality of the meat is important, and I want to taste the meat. So I'm no longer doing it to preserve the meat. I'm doing it so that I can enjoy the meat. And that's like everything in charcuterie right now. It's not really for preserving, it's for enjoyment. We use the best techniques from the tradition, and we apply new techniques to make it even better. And so this is why also I don't get stuck in arguments with people when they say, their nonna did it 50 years ago, and that's how she does it, and that's the way her nonna did it, and her nonna did it for 6 generations. That's how it was done. Nobody's going to question it. But guys, then we'd still be riding in carriages, because my great-grandfather had a carriage, and that's what he rode around in. But we don't. We drive in modern cars. And, as technology changes, cars get better. And we can argue that one as well. But generally, cars are better than what they were 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So the same with this. The techniques advance, machinery advances. We again, if I look at my great-grandparents, they would cure meat in a specific way because they had to preserve it. They didn't really have refrigeration. So getting back to smoking, I don't apply smoke for a long time. I add the taste of the smoke, and that's it, done. And that's what we've got to understand, is that we're really wanting to showcase. That's the word I was looking for earlier. We're really wanting to showcase the meat again as the center action, or the center of attention. And so we want to be liberal with what we do to the meat, so that we've got those flavors that we're trying to inject, the chili or the cumin or whatever it is that we're trying to do, but we can still taste the meat, and the meat remains the predominant flavor. And again, quality of meat. If your meat is not good, that flavor is not going to be great either. So, simple scenario. I reiterate, buy the best quality meat that you can afford. And if you can't afford it, and what you can afford is not great, then don't do it, because you are going to waste your money. Money that you can't afford to waste, you will waste. And that's all I can say about that. I think it's just that. It's probably the one single most important thing, is the quality of the meat. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my YouTube channel.